Hello and welcome back to another edition of Civil Discussion on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, September 5th. Also a great pleasure to have our co-host, Don Keelan, here. Don?
Andrew, good to be here.
Good to have you back. And we are really privileged and honored to have with us today our special guest, Paul Heintz, who is the editor-in-chief of VTDigger, an online daily news source for Vermonters. He started there as the managing editor back in January of 2021 and was named the editor-in-chief in November of 2022. Before that, he worked at 7 Days, a newspaper based in Burlington, as a reporter, a columnist, and a political editor. He was also named Journalist of the Year by the New England Society of News Editors and won the New England Newspaper and Press Association's First Amendment Award for his successful advocacy of Vermont's first media shield law. So, Paul, we are deeply honored to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
Well, thank you for making the time.
Of course.
Now, you're down here in part because in a few hours from now, you and Skye Barsh, the publisher of VTDigger, will be holding what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting and informative conversation with Jill Lepore, a historian and journalist. She's written for the New Yorker magazine. You're going to be talking about the role of the media in our democracy and communities. So I just thought, just to kind of get us started here today, and by the way, folks, you'll be able to watch that show on GNAT in a few days, I imagine, in the event that you're not planning on getting up to the library by 5 o'clock this afternoon. Some of you may be, but anyway. Yeah, so what will you all be talking about this afternoon?
Well, I've been reading Jill Lepore's work for many years. For those unfamiliar with it, she's just an incredible writer, has focused on American history and particularly the history of the Constitution. And she's written for the New Yorker since, I believe, the mid-1990s. We learned somewhat recently that she's actually spends a fair amount of time in southern Vermont as well. She lives in Cambridge, Mass, where she teaches, but she is a frequenter of these parts and turns out as a reader of VTDigger. So when we learned that, we had to get her on the hook to come and speak at an event, and we're really excited to talk through some of the most vexing issues of our day, particularly around the role of the media in American democracy, both locally but also nationally. So I think there'll be a lot to talk about. We'll be hearing some remarks from Jill and then taking questions from audience members, and I imagine it'll be a pretty lively discussion.
Oh, I'm sure it will be. Don?
Paul, how do we get the Digger to have more of a presence in southwestern Vermont, in light of the fact that we've lost a number of papers here, and occasionally the Digger will cover southwestern Vermont, but how do we get an embedded reporter and same coverage, not the same coverage, but more coverage?
It's a great question. So we have been trying to make sure that we're covering all parts of Vermont for many years now. Just to step back a little bit in VTDigger's history, this is our 15th year now, and VTDigger started off as a one-person shop founded by Ann Galloway, who did a phenomenal job focusing on investigative reporting, and then expanded that to State House reporting. Over the years, it became clear to Ann that we needed to be a much more of a statewide news organization, get out of the State House, get out of Montpelier, and find stories throughout Vermont. And so we have invested over the years in a number of reporters in southern Vermont, and we have a position right now we're actually hiring for. So our most recent southern Vermont reporter who focused on Bennington, Rutland counties, left for another job a month or two ago, and we're actually currently in the hiring process. So my hope is that next time I see you both, it will be with alongside our new southwestern Vermont reporter. I think in terms of what VTDigger does, we see ourselves as a statewide news outlet, and so we're not really able to focus as much as I would like on hyper-local stories. But we do think it's really important to have people in all parts of the state to look for trends, to look for stories that may be taking place in Bennington, but would be really interesting to someone living outside of Bennington. We're never going to supplant the role of truly local media, but we think we can complement it, and we can kind of approach a story from a different perspective or with different resources, and hopefully add to the discussion. But primarily it's going to be the local newspapers and local news organizations that are they're going to need to keep doing the really hard and really important work of covering local select boards and local government, local institutions. You can't really do that with one reporter spread out over 2 pretty large counties. So even when we're fully staffed and have people in all these regions around the state, we're still approaching it from a higher altitude.
May I follow up with another one along those lines? A few years ago, I know when Ann was running the Digger, and then it stopped. The Digger was present in our newspaper down here. In other words, the local newspapers published stories that were in the Digger, and that stopped for I don't know whether it was a business reason or whatever. But can we find that could be reinstitutionalized and get that back into our local paper? Is there because the local paper publishes stories from the Washington Post, but that's all. Some people might find that interesting, but I like to find out the stories that the Digger has would be great if we could have them down here to those folks who don't necessarily read or go online.
That's right. Yeah, my understanding is that at one point, VTDigger shared a reporter with the Bennington Banner for some years, but that relationship and the end of it predated my arrival, so I don't know too much about that. What I can tell you is that we have partnerships with about a dozen community newspapers around the state, and the arrangement basically is that we allow them to republish any of our news stories for free. And then many of them allow us to republish their news stories. It's a great arrangement. It allows for our stories to get into the hands of more readers, especially people who maybe receive the weekly newspaper in the mail. I think we reach audiences that we wouldn't ordinarily reach, people who wouldn't be as inclined to go online and search us out. So, and of course, it's, I think, a great benefit to the papers that we partner with as well. They can use our legislative coverage or statewide coverage. And we're always happy to talk with other news outlets about expanding those partnerships. So I haven't heard directly from that particular newspaper group, but yeah, we would absolutely have a conversation with anyone who's interested in partnering. We think that partnerships are really important in this day and age. Most news outlets are experiencing pretty significant challenges. Some of them are the same, some of them are different, but I think we all kind of realize we need to be working together and spending less time competing with one another, at least for financial resources. We can compete on the stories, but we need to look for ways to support one another because it's just not going to work without local papers thriving, statewide papers thriving, so on and so forth.
So a story that was in the Digger, done by one of your reporters, that story is available to the, let's say, the Bennington Banner, if they want to publish it.
It's available to any of the papers that we have partnerships with.
Okay, so they need to become they're under new ownership now, the last couple of years, so I'm not sure they're aware of it. I know the previous owners, there was some kind of disagreement. And,
yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk with anyone. I think.
Okay, I'd like to arrange that.
Doing some business here right on air.
Wow, there we go. Paul, I wondered if we could talk a little bit about this whole issue that probably is going to be at the heart of your conversation this afternoon with Joe Lepore, and it's a subject we've talked about on the show several times already, and that's the whole, I guess, role of the news media in, what's the right word here, maybe mediating the polarization and divisions that seem to be at play in the country and in our democracy right now, where we have one part of the country thinking one thing and another thinking the other thing, and it seems like a lot of that is a direct result of the, for lack of a better term, news silos that people are in. If you're just watching Fox News or outlets like that, you're going to get one take on what's going on in the world. If you read the New York Times and the Washington Post, you get a different one. That didn't always seem to me to be the case. I mean, back in the era when we did have a lot of thriving, robust local newspapers, and the industry was in fairly good shape, it seemed like, people got their news from a common source and it was by and large trusted. We don't seem to be in that place anymore. Do you think there's a way that the news media, in the way it's going to be evolving, with social media, digital outlets, is there a way to kind of help break through those silos? Do you think?
It's a great question, and maybe that's 5 different questions
Yeah,
all
I
embedded
know.
in that. I'll try
I'm
to
good
tease
at
it out a little
that.
bit, because I think you raise a lot of really interesting and tough questions here. So I would agree with the premise of the question. I think where people are operating in silos, they're getting different information. It's hard to have a conversation with someone else if you're starting from a place where you've got different versions of reality. And so, I think one thing that is clear is that local media tends to be trusted a lot more these days than national media. And I think that there are some real opportunities for local media to kind of chart the way forward. And one reason for that is that people see what's happening in their communities. And they know if their local news organization is reflecting what they're seeing. And similarly, for local news organizations that are truly based in a place, and particularly ones that are either locally owned or local nonprofits, they're really tied to their communities. They really have to reflect the reality of what people are seeing. So I think that the local newspaper, organizations like ours, I think we have an opportunity to sort of build trust with readers, to show them that what we're trying to do, and not that we always succeed at this, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to reflect reality as best we can. We're trying to share information. We're trying to help people come to their own conclusions and not come to conclusions for them. So I think there's a really important role that local media can play in that process of rebuilding trust. I do think there are, we know that more partisan-leaning media sources, there's a profit motive for that, right? It's not surprising that a Fox News or an MSNBC operates the way that they do. That's how you draw a really passionate audience. But I think that approach, can do a disservice to democracy. So we at VTDigger really try to avoid that to the extent that we can. Obviously, we will bring our biases to our work. It's unavoidable. We're human beings. We have our work, our reporting, our editing. It's all informed by our experiences, by our worldview, by where we live. Where in Vermont we live, that's unavoidable. But at places like Digger, we try to overcome those biases to the extent that we can. We try to show our work whenever we can. We often will embed documents. We'll link to original sources. We'll try to find ways to say, don't just believe us. You can find this information out for yourself. And there are other steps that we take as a news organization to build trust with readers. For example, we spent a lot of time working on our voter guide in advance of the current election cycle. And that voter guide allows people to figure out information about their districts, the people running, where they live. We send out a questionnaire. We provide a lot of basic facts for people to use. And we think resources like that can be really helpful and to build trust. I feel like I've answered maybe 2 out of 5 of your questions, so please redirect me if I've lost 3 others.
Okay. Don,
Let me stay with the again. We have the senior editor of the Digger here, so I want to ask questions of the editor.
Sure.
Why doesn't the Digger have an editorial comment?
Well, the reason for that is actually has to do with the IRS. So we are a nonprofit, and we are actually pretty restricted in what we can, in how we can advocate. We basically can't advocate around political positions. So we're far more constrained than a traditional privately owned newspaper. One area where this is top of mind right now for me is we have an opinion section. As you know, and we try to run a diversity of views and opinions from across the state. But around elections, we actually cannot run commentaries or letters to the editor that advocate for or against a particular candidate for office. That is a staple of the community newspaper, right? You have letters to the editor that are supporting a local candidate. If we run one of those, we actually run the risk of losing our our tax-exempt status with the IRS. So even printing a commentary from some other person saying you should vote for this person or vote against this person, we cannot do that. And so I think there would be similar concerns in if we had an editorial page or an editorial, where we actually printed our own views. I think we could run afoul of IRS regulations. I also personally think, and this is just speaking for myself here, that wouldn't necessarily, I think, help to build trust with readers. I do think that we have an issue around media literacy in this country. I think that there are a lot of people we find that don't understand the difference between the editorial in the New York Times, the op-ed in the New York Times, and the news story in the New York Times. And they see one thing, they conflate it with another. We see that in our own work. When we publish a commentary from somebody, I often hear from people who say, why does VTDigger think such and such? Well, we don't think that. We're just publishing a commentary that reflects someone else's views. So I think if we were to say that this institution believes in this, that we agree with this policy or oppose that policy or support this candidate or that candidate, I think we would just alienate readers. I think we wouldn't build trust. I think we wouldn't bring people in. And we're trying to do that. We're trying to bring people in to this common understanding or common set of facts, at least, so they can come to their own conclusions.
By the way, I'm not saying that you should have an editorial that supports a candidate or on the political side. I'm saying what I'm trying to get to maybe, can the Digger have an editorial on certain state issues, the drug issue, the housing issue, the homeless issue. There's so many issues in the state without getting into the politics of it. Obviously, there's some politics.
But it's inherently political. I mean, I think even getting into those, it suggests that we, believe a certain thing, and that might color our coverage as well. I think our resources are better spent investing in the reporting. Anyone can have an opinion. I don't think that our opinions among the editors or staff at VTDigger are any more valid than anybody else's, and I hesitate to promote those opinions. I think our job really is, what are the facts? That's the added value that we can bring. We can go to the State House, we can interrogate lawmakers, we can request public documents, and we can provide all that information to people, and they can come to their own conclusions.
And the reason I brought the question up is, we don't get the Rutland Herald down here anymore, and the Banner and the Journal, the Manchester Journal, which Andrew was the editor for quite a while, no longer publish editorials by the, and it was, part of it was helpful in interpreting the news and not having an opinion, but giving an interpretation from another source. But
yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think we could do more analysis. I could see a situation where we had, perhaps a political columnist, which we have had in the past. John Margolis, who died recently, was a political columnist for VTDigger for some years, and I think he did a very good job of helping to interpret the news. He wasn't pushing a particular opinion, but he could go a little bit further than a traditional reporter could, and kind of guide the reader, through what was happening. So I think that's a fair point. I think one other thing that's changed, we've seen sort of a decline, I think, in the traditional newspaper editorial page. Part of that is tied to the decline of the traditional newspaper in general. But I think another part of it is that there are so many tools now to share one's own opinion through social media that it's almost as if everybody has their own editorial page, on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is, right? We're awash in opinion. There's no dearth of it. And I think what there is a dearth of sometimes is facts and reporting. And so, with limited resources, that's sort of the direction that I tend to go in. I do think, there's an argument that we could be doing more and should be doing more in helping to create more of a space for argument and disagreement, expanding our opinion section. I'd love to do that, for example. And because I think that we are lacking in kind of a town square that has some moderation, right? We have a Facebook, right, where you can kind of yell back and forth at one another till the cows come home. What I think could be helpful is to have a space that has some guardrails, around truth, for example, but allows people to advance different views and evaluate them. It's tricky, though, for an organization like ours because we have to fact check everything that we publish. So even if it's opinion, the opinion piece cannot just make something up. And the process of fact checking opinion pieces is incredibly time intensive, in part because you're working with people who are not typically trained as reporters, who don't necessarily know sort of how to verify information, how to cite sources, that kind of thing. If you just kind of print everything. We used to have a comments section in under every story. We'd publish pretty much anything that someone wrote. You could get into libelous territory really quickly there, and to moderate that is incredibly time intensive.
I remember when you dropped that. Remember that became pretty high.
A lot of people were really unhappy with it because it
were.
was a great place to share views, but it was also, I think, a legally tricky place for the organization to be. And this predated me, but I think the decision was sound to drop it.
But some people abused it.
Yeah,
no question about it.
Totally.
Speaking of news coverage you've done recently that I'm sure must have taxed the resources, I wanted to ask you about the extreme weather phenomenon we've seen here in the last, 2 years really. Last year we had a lot more flooding. You guys did a lot of reporting on that. I mean, was it, what did you decide to kind of gear up and really cover that to the depth and extent that you did? I mean, obviously huge stories. But,
yeah. It's been fascinating to be part of that. I think that in some ways our experience covering COVID helped to prepare us for this. Very different types of disasters, but in both cases, people's lives were in great danger. And there was a role for the news media, the local and state news media, to share information, vetted information, quickly, make it accessible to people so that they could make the right decisions for themselves, protect themselves, stay safe in whatever way. So I think COVID prepared us for this. I think we also were somewhat fortunate in the way that we're structured. We were, I think, well set up to cover these floods, in part because we have reporters around the state in various places. We have reporters who are already focused on certain policy areas. So, for example, we've got an excellent energy, environment, climate reporter who can, who's ready to go, knows who to call when extreme weather hits. We have sort of a great team that's ready to rock and can cover things on a breaking news basis, but also write more in-depth stories. So when the first round of floods hit on July 10th, 2023, we just threw every resource we had at covering these floods. We sent people all around the state, published, I think, like 120 stories or so in the first week. Many of them were very short. They were dispatches from small towns around the state. They were updates on the latest guidance from public officials. We were trying to show what was happening in Vermont, what could happen, how people could prepare for it. And I think that the medium itself is well suited for this because the situation was changing on the hour. I think a traditional print newspaper, especially a weekly newspaper, while invaluable in most times, they had a harder time in a fast-moving situation like this, really providing that information in a way that could be as useful. So we felt like we were sort of, we were lucky to be in the position we were when this happened, and we recognized the importance of covering it as closely as we could. So yeah, for the first 4 or 6 weeks after that flooding last year, we were pretty much around the clock, focusing almost entirely on the storm and its aftermath. And I think that has given, having done that first time, we were ready, last December when we had another round, and we were ready this July 10th when we had another round, and then this July 30th or whatever when we had another round. And unfortunately, these extreme weather events keep happening. They're going to keep happening. This is something that we all have to get better at, covering it, and we've learned lessons along the way as well. I mean, I think there are things that we're doing better now that we're keeping in mind around future coverage as well.
Well, you make a good point that being a digital publication, you were able to move very quickly and get stories out fast. That were you just a traditional print paper, that would have taken a lot longer, and then it was a matter of getting the paper out to the customers
Exactly.
anyway.
Exactly.
But I wanted to ask you kind of along that line. Digger was one of the first news outlets I can think of that kind of used the nonprofit model, different from, again, the traditional newspaper business where it was a business, and at the end of the day, the publisher wanted to show a positive return. Obviously, dollars and cents are important in a nonprofit business too, but I guess I just wonder, do you think the way it's going in the journalism world today, that the nonprofit model really is what we're going to see going forward, that's able to sustain itself through all the vicissitudes of advertising ups and downs and classified advertising going away and all of that?
I think so, but it's hard to say. So I mean, to step back a little bit, the model that we use now, we and not just VTDigger, but sort of this class of nonprofit digital news organizations, we basically stole it from public radio, right? Public radio has been doing a version of this for decades and decades. They've been producing high quality journalism available to all. And then they've been asking listeners to pay for it if it's valuable to them with those pledge drives that go on and on and on, right? So in some ways, it's an age-old model. What's new is that it's being applied to the written word in a way that had not previously been the case. So when Ann Galloway founded VTDigger, it did become part of this kind of first class of nonprofit digital news organizations, and they are everywhere now. I mean, it is amazing to see. Every state has one. Many states have multiple VTDiggers. And some of them are doing really well. Some of them are struggling. Nonprofits, the nonprofit model works, but it only works if people will actually contribute to it, right? Being a nonprofit, that's just a tax status, right? So we still need to make all the money we're spending, right? We don't need to make more. We don't need to satisfy shareholders, and that's a huge advantage, right? I think in a lot of the corporate owned newspapers, what you saw for many decades was that these papers could sustain themselves, but they couldn't sustain sending all those profits to investors, right? All we have to do is break even. But even that is hard for us. And I think we're doing better than most news organizations in Vermont, but we're still struggling. And because we need to be able to make the case to people that it's worth supporting what we do. So every year we need to get out there and we need to convince people to make smaller, regular contributions or bigger gifts. We still need to find advertisers. We call them underwriters, but it's the same idea. We still need to go out and hustle to get grants. We've got a $3.2 million budget. That's less than we were spending 2-3 years ago, and it's less because it's been hard to raise the money. I think some of it is we've been victims of our own success. I think people see VTDigger as growing and thriving, maybe think, I don't need to support it, but the fact is we do need people to support it. And I think that kind of culturally, over the last couple of decades, we've moved away from this sense in America where you used to subscribe to the local newspaper, right? You used to pay for your news. Then everything became free, and we assumed that we could just get it online, never have to pay for it. Well, it's not free to produce. It's never going to be. And we need to kind of change the attitude in this country to say, if you actually want to know what's going on, you have to find some way to contribute to that, whether that's donating to a VTDigger or contributing to a public radio affiliate or subscribing to your local newspaper. I would encourage everybody with the means to subscribe to their local paper because that's the only way they can keep going, or to advertise in their local paper. Is it the future? I think it is part of the future. I think the real future lies in people valuing journalism and finding a way, however they can, to support it to the extent that they can.
Andrew stole my thunder a little bit with that, but I was going to ask. No, that's okay. I was going to ask. We know where you've been the last 5 years. Where do you think you'll be 5 years from now?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, I could see So I'm, the CEO of VTDigger, Sky Barsh, might yell at me for saying this, but I'd love to be twice as big as we are right now. I mean, I think that we could, if we had twice as much money as we do, I could easily fill a newsroom with twice as many people. I would love to have reporters in every, in every county of the state. There's so many topical beats that I would expand. I'd love to, there's so much reporting that needs to be done. The overall number of journalists in Vermont, like everywhere, has declined immensely over the last couple of decades. But we can only be as big as we can afford to be.
Well, I think that word needs to get out because I think that may be the future. And to our audience, the Digger is a part of the Journalism Trust of Vermont. That's the 501c3 that you can make contributions to.
That's right. You can just go to our website.
You can plug the program here. Let me get back to the operations of the Digger for a moment. On another program I was involved with the president of a major publishing company, he was telling us that he's having difficulty with his young editors in covering stories. And reviewing manuscripts that they didn't agree with. Do you have a similar problem in the Digger where you have stories or individuals that you want to assign a reporter to, but they just don't necessarily agree with that individual or that organization or that? You understand where I'm coming from?
I do, yeah, and I actually I can't think of that really being a challenge for us right now. I can see why it would be, and in some realms perhaps. I think that we recognize, we talk a lot in our newsroom, as any newsroom does, about conflicts of interest, about bias, and how do we reconcile the fact that we all do have our own views with the fact that our job is not to promote those views, it's not to allow those views to influence our coverage to the extent that we can avoid it. We talk about, what do you do if you have a conflict of interest? Whether, maybe that's because your spouse or your partner works for a certain organization. Maybe it's because you donated to a political candidate 10 years ago. Maybe it's because you just feel strongly about a particular issue. We really encourage our reporters and our editors, this applies to me as much as anybody, to identify those potential biases, those potential conflicts, and to share them with their editor or their boss, and to kind of talk through it, and talk through what are the steps that we can take to best serve the reader. So in some cases that means recusing a reporter from covering a particular topic because they have, at some point in the past done something on one side or the other of it, right? So that does happen. But for the most part, I find the people who gravitate to working at a place like VTDigger, they don't want to be advocates. If they want to be advocates, they'd be doing something else. There's plenty of advocacy news organizations. You can go work on a political campaign, but if you're going to do the hard work of being a journalist, you have to approach it like a journalist. So, yeah, I can't think of a specific example that matches what you're saying, but I completely understand the point, and I imagine that is a challenge. It was
a major challenge, a serious challenge for the president of this major international book publishing company. That the young editors they just did not want to review that manuscript.
To go back to one of your earlier questions, right, about say we took stances on certain issues, right? Like I think that could create a real big problem with certain staffers if they disagreed with them, right? An issue like the war in Gaza, right? That is an issue that most people have some very deeply felt views about that, right? And they're fraught. It's a really challenging conversation to have, right? I'm sure many of my colleagues have all sorts of different views about that. I'm glad that we don't have to take a position on that, right? I'm glad that I'm also glad that frankly we don't have to cover it super closely because we're a statewide news organization. What we do cover is how people are protesting, how people are advocating on one side or the other, what are our public officials doing, how are they voting on certain issues. And I think when you're approaching those questions, you can do so even if you have a view about the conflict in the first place.
Well, interesting you mentioned the Gaza and so forth. the 7 days did an extensive, I was telling Andrew, a deep study, not a deep study, a deep reporting, yesterday I believe it was, on the Pride Center of Vermont, and the fact that the administration took a position on Gaza that the board members did not agree with,
Right.
and 4 or 5 of the board members, or something like that, up and left, and
Yeah.
and it was quite, you know, from a nonprofit the way I look at nonprofits, I found that very interesting. Setting aside the Hamas Gaza issue, and but that would be a story you would have covered. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
You would have had no trouble.
I can't think of any story we wouldn't cover. I mean, our job is to cover every. I mean, we can't cover every story just for the sake because we don't have enough resources to do so. But there's no subject that's off limits to us. And frankly, the harder the subject, the more I'm interested in covering it.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because that was not the case years ago with when you were not you, but the Digger was covering the EB-5 and the Burlington College issue. There was a lot of pressure put on the Digger not to cover those stories.
Yeah, I
a
can't.
lot of pressure.
I can't speak to that, but because I wasn't there. But you know, the more pressure, the better. I say, you know,
okay.
if people
Good.
are pressuring you not to write something, then you probably should be writing about it even more. And yeah, I mean, you know, we try to tackle controversial subjects. I mean, the one thing I would say is that we do want to keep a Vermont focus. So that's one area that we don't focus on is things that happen outside the state unless there's a real Vermont connection, because we think that's what our job is. That's what our mission is.
Yep. I'm sorry.
You know, I wanted to ask you a bit about that award you won for the Media Shield Law thing. Was that the story about the gun control one, or is that?
It's a little different. Yeah, it happened around the same time, but
I guess I wondered if you explained also what the Media Shield Law is all about.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So, this goes back some number of years, but you know, it is a common problem around the country that reporters, when they're doing their jobs and they're finding out information about what's happening, they will come upon information that would be really helpful for law enforcement to have. Law enforcement is doing its job. It wants as much information as possible, and it will often attempt to subpoena a reporter or an editor. Law enforcement will try to get the notes that a reporter may have taken during an interview. They may even try to put a reporter on the stand. When law enforcement does that, you know, for legitimate reasons, they're trying to do their job, it has a really negative impact on the work that journalists do, because people will be less inclined to speak with a journalist if they know that a journalist can basically become an arm of law enforcement. So you don't need me to tell you this, but for audience members, it's so important for us to stay separate, right, so that we can hold law enforcement accountable, so that we can get to the bottom of what's happening. And we need everyone to be able to trust us, whether it's the person accused of a crime, whether it's the victim of a crime, whoever it is. We need to be able to talk to all parties. We need to be able to get the truth to the extent that we can from all parties, and then we need to share it with our readers. Well, you know, I learned the hard way when this happened. I want to say it was 2015 or 2016, how poor the protections were in Vermont for reporters. I learned this while I was covering allegations that a state senator from Franklin County had allegedly assaulted a couple of people. He was initially charged with sex trafficking. It was a pretty horrific story. And so I and my colleagues, I was working for 7 days at that time, we did our job, we reported this out, and then you know, at one point we were subpoenaed by law enforcement, and we were, you know, we had to fight it. We had to spend a ton of money to defend our right to hold on to our notes, to not be put up on the stand. This motivated us to get to ask the question, why don't we have a shield law to protect reporters from this? And what a shield law does is it basically says that, you know, law enforcement either cannot obtain this information or it can only do so under certain limited circumstances. Perhaps they've exhausted all other possible angles or whatever it is. So we worked with a number of other organizations, with television stations, with Vermont Public Radio, as it was called at the time, and with VTDigger. I wasn't at VTDigger, but we partnered with VTDigger at 7 Days. And we basically went to the legislature and said, you got to change this. You got to create a media shield law. We, I think, had some good timing. It was the very first year of the Trump administration, and people were thinking a lot about, kind of the dialogue, shall we say, between government and the press. And I think legislators understood how important this was, and they really, it wasn't that hard to convince them, to be honest with you, when we showed them kind of real life examples of what happens when you don't have a media shield law. So, one of my colleagues at the time talked about how, he had been planning to write a story about people who are victims of sex trafficking. And he felt like he couldn't pursue the story because he was worried that he'd be subpoenaed, and people that he was trying to write about and explore the challenges they face, that they could actually end up going to jail because of his reporting. So the legislature ended up passing, and Governor Scott ended up signing into law what became actually one of the strongest media shield laws in the country. And so, when you pass a media shield law, you don't know what situations you're preventing because they don't happen. Right. But we have, it seems that anecdotally, there are far fewer cases of of state and local law enforcement trying to pull reporters' information and make them testify.
Did you have another question, Don?
I have one more, and I may have asked this of you before in our passing. It appears to me, and this, I'm making a sort of a generalization here, in the reporting that I see in Vermont, that reporters, for the most part, in reporting the story, and they do well at that, but they don't have the financial background to dig into the real financial crux of a story. And I think part of that, and I've had some experience in working with reporters on this, is they're really gun shy when they take a look at a financial statement or a set of financial statements and or a tax return of a corporation or a nonprofit and so forth. And is there a way in which there can be more training so that when we get to hear a story and we get more of the financial impact of it? And a case in point was one I saw in Burlington. They opened up the COTS Center, COTS. It's a 16-unit, $8.4 million project, and that was reported, and those were the facts. But in digging a bit more, that was over $500,000 a unit. And then there's another one now at the Legion. You hear the total cost, but just digging a little bit more. And then this was critical, by the way, when back in the days we worked on, when I was working with the Digger on as an advisor on the EB-5. Yeah. And that was you could fill this room with all the papers that came out of that, or the Burlington College, or the Coventry issue there was an embezzlement up in Coventry. Am I mistaken, or do reporters have a financial background but just don't apply it?
I think you're not mistaken for the most part. I mean, I would say that most reporters, especially at this level, are generalists and don't have advanced training in really any realm, right? A lot of us, myself very much included, I went to college, but I didn't go to graduate school. I don't have any advanced training in anything. Studied history, so what do I know about much else? So we come to this field, I think, with quite a bit of curiosity, maybe some experience writing, an interest in asking questions and learning more. And it's the thing that I love most about journalism is you learn so much in the process. And when I was writing, what I loved is covering a new topic because I'd come into it knowing absolutely nothing about it. And that can be an advantage because you can ask questions that may sound like stupid questions, but are actually quite revealing. You come to a subject with fresh eyes. And you don't just accept something as a given, but it can be a real disadvantage if you don't understand how to read, financial records of some sort or another. So it's a mix, and I think you need to, if you're an early career journalist without a lot of advanced training, you really need to figure out who the experts are who can help you out. Maybe that's going to you personally, right? As we've done in the past, and maybe that's working with a really experienced editor who knows how to do that, or just finding good sources who can help walk through a document. But I think would I love it if everyone on my staff had an advanced degree? If I had someone who went to law school, someone who had a PhD, and whatever, that would be awesome, but it's not the world we live in. And I think that's okay. I think as long as you know what you don't know, and you know how to get the information that you need. I think journalists who don't do a great job are those who are a little too self-confident, who think that they know the answer to everything. The best journalists I find are the ones who assume their own incompetence, assume their own stupidity, and just and embrace that, and go into every story assuming they don't know the first thing about it, but they got to find the best people who know the most about it, and find out what questions to ask even before asking the questions.
I mean, and a few years ago, and this is prior now to your coming on board, I know I've worked with 4 or 5 reporters at the Digger. When they did a financial story, they would send the material down to me to take a look at and interpret. Now, I'm not available, much that, you're getting up there in a bit. And I've retired as a CPA, but the thing is, there's other people that might be willing to help them provide interpretation, provide assistance. And I think my suggestion is, and it's not just to the Digger, but to other papers when I see, you go out and reach out a little bit. Because so much of what is reported is financial. And the bottom line is financial. I mean, you cut through a lot of
Every story is.
There's a financial impact. Even for example, you cover quite a few of the embezzlements in Vermont. And then, the court did this, sentences and so forth. And then I always ask, well, what's the tax department of Vermont? What's their position on that person who just, took $100,000, has been found guilty of $100,000 embezzlement? That's income. And some people are saying, geez, they got $100,000, didn't pay any taxes, and I have to pay taxes. But so I'm just to go that extra step. What's the tax implications of that embezzlement story? So it's just I know we're getting low on time here.
No, it's great advice. It's great advice. I mean, it's something to, as you say that, I think, maybe we need a panel of experts, in every field that we can go to. We have that kind of informally.
Well, that's a great way to put it. A panel of experts, that be willing to help the reporters. I enjoyed working with the young reporters. I mean, it was really fascinating. And I had the time, back then, and the stories were interesting. I mean, I don't have to tell you about EB5, and you know a lot about it. But I know we're running out of time, right?
We are getting, down to the time where we're going to have to run real quick. I just had one last quick question. I just wanted to throw your way, Paul. And I guess it kind of loops back to the first 5 questions that I asked. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about, particularly this election year, how, again, overused term, but polarized is the word that seems to come up, and the fact that so many people seem to be unable to talk with each other, even if they're friends or neighbors or whatever. If they come at political issues from different points of view, it seems like increasingly, at least my sense of it is that it's very hard for people. At one point, could have sat down over a cup of coffee and disagreed, but would have done it in a kind of civil way. And that whole idea was kind of what was the premise of this program that Don and I have been doing now for the past 3 years or so. And I guess I just wanted to, do you have concerns that what we're seeing today is going to be continuing for a fairly lengthy period of time, or is it going to be sort of like just one more cycle in a long-running saga that goes back to the Declaration of Independence, I guess? But I don't know. Do you worry that we're going to be stuck in this for a long time?
Right.
In a very unhealthy place, it seems like.
I always get in trouble when I try to predict the future because I'm usually totally wrong. What I will say is, and you alluded to this in your question, and it's something that Jill Lepore has written about and thought about a lot, but the history of the news media in this country is not as glorious as we sometimes think of it, right? We often kind of go back to, the 1950s, the 1960s, when American journalism was in pretty good shape, where we go back to the Watergate period. But the reality is that, through much of the 18th and 19th centuries, like journalism was basically Fox News, right? it was broadsheet newspapers, and a given city might have 5 or 10 different newspapers with 5 or 10 different viewpoints, and they weren't necessarily reporting facts as we think of them today. So things have been bad before and they got better. Things seem bad and getting worse now, but I think they could get better. But I think we need to demand it as readers and as members of this society and of this country. We need to decide that what we want is facts, and we need to demand it. We need to support it, and that's the only way we're going to get it. We also need to get out of our bubbles. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I'm a homebody. I'm not getting out and about as much as I probably should be. But when we leave our comfortable circles and talk with people who are, have different views or just different life experiences as us, it can really inform the way that we view the world. I think that's one slight advantage that Vermont has over other places is that we're so small. We do kind of have to interact with one another, right? Like you go out to the grocery store, and you're going to run into Bernie Sanders. If you go to the Hannaford's and Winooski or whatever, right? You're going to run into people, and you're going to have to see them face to face. So the person who you may have written something nasty about on Facebook, like they're there right in front of you now, and you have to chat with them. And I think being such a small community forces us to behave a little bit better. And I think that we need to be more intentional about that. We need to seek out other people. If we have a disagreement, we shouldn't just write something online to them or about them. We need to find a way to have that conversation. It's harder to do. It can be uncomfortable, but it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, Don, we're going to leave it there.
Yeah, we can do that.
Thanks again, Paul Heintz, the editor-in-chief of VTDigger, for being with us today. And thanks to all of you as well for spending part of your day with us as well. Don, I guess we'll be back again in a couple of weeks with the next episode of Civil Discussion, but we'll leave it there for today. And thanks to all very much.
Can we ask Paul just to give the address of Vermont Digger to our audience so they can?
Of course. How could I?
I don't know what it is. Oh, well, the web address I do. Yeah.
No,
the physical address.
Post office box.
I should know that. I study up next time.
It's in Montpelier.
But if you go to vtdigger.org,
you'll find it.
And if you click the button that says contact, that will have our PO box. And it also, if you want to contribute online, there are ways to do that as well.
And you heard they're a nonprofit, so they could use the help.
Right.
And read it, and also subscribe to our newsletters, because that can be a really great way to get our stories each morning. So thank you.
First thing I read every morning.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. It's good to see you both.
All right. Thanks again for being with us today. We'll see you the next time.